Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Yves Remy, and I am the director of the Shridath Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus in Barbados. I'd like to welcome you to this second of our webinar series in furtherance of an arrangement between the SRC and the U.S. Embassy in Barbados to promote US-CARICOM trade and investment relations. We at the SRC have been generously provided with funding to launch a series of activities encompassing university exchanges between the Caribbean, U.W.I, and universities in the United States, research on topics relevant to trade and investment between the region and the United States, opportunities for our students, as well as webinars like this one, which we hope will spearhead thinking for the region on how to advance the economic component of US-CARICOM relations. As you would all appreciate, this is a particularly interesting time for these relations, especially in terms of the geopolitics of it. It's very topical right now with the upcoming Summit of the Americas happening in June in Los Angeles, and a lot of uncertainty about how and even whether the region will participate in that summit. As many of you may recall, our first webinar, which was held in December last year, focused on identifying those US entities with responsibility for trade and investment relations between the region and the United States, and a basic overview of the nature of the initiatives over the years between our regions. And that webinar, the video recording, is available on the SRC's website. But today's topic of discussion is slightly different: exploring business opportunities for and with the private sector, a transactional focus. Now, many of you may have wondered why the reference to transactional focus, and the reason for us is simple. We wanted one of our webinars to focus less on the governmental processes defining the relationship with the US and more squarely on possibilities for the private sector to strengthen our import, export, and investment potential with the US. Many of you will know that the US is our single largest trading partner, both in terms of our exports and import markets. According to some figures, US trade with the region reached as much as $35 billion in 2018, including a US trade surplus of $12 billion, a value of 10% greater than the year before. Often in these discussions, the primary focus is on US investments into this region, which is understandable given the sizable CARICOM deficit in trade and investment between our countries. But we also want in this webinar to think more offensively about possibilities for new export vistas into the vast and lucrative US market, especially bearing in mind the fact that much of our diaspora is concentrated in the US. We know that activity happening on the ground in terms of advancing the US private sector relations with the Caribbean are happening. Look at Caribbean Export Development Agency, represented here, has been working on that. And there's been a lot of discussion about increased investment, especially in Jamaica in its BPO sector, and of course, Guyana with the recent discovery of oil. These developments signify that there are seeds for growing commercial links with the United States. Before I present our stellar cast of panelists, let me hand the floor over to Dr. David Lewis, who represents the Caribbean Policy Consortium and is co-hosting this webinar with the SRC and US Embassy. He will provide a few brief welcome remarks, and then I will turn to introduce our panelists. Over to you, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, and thank you all who are watching us today and our colleagues on the webinar. It is very timely indeed, despite some delays we had in our programming, but I think the timing came up excellent, that just now on the eve of the Summit of the Americas, which will have a business forum and a CEO summit, that we focus on this initiative regarding business opportunities and transactions between the CARICOM region and the United States, and particularly some of the key new path-breaking areas that Caribbean companies are working on, not just in manufactured goods and new products, but also particularly in the thriving and dynamic services sector. I'd like to give a shout out to Caribbean Export because of a recent project last year on services exports into the US, which soon will be presented in a webinar, and you all will be invited. And also to the Inter-American Development Bank that last year worked on a series of almost a dozen nearshoring studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, of which 4 were on the Caribbean and all in the region: Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Trinidad and Tobago, identifying about a dozen services and other sectors for nearshoring already taking place, and also some prospective, and also providing support to the regional investment promotion agencies, many of which have undertaken reforms and changes in order to deal not only with the new virtual world of business as a result of the pandemic, but also many of the new opportunities in times of limited resources. So I think those are 2 institutional initiatives happening within the region and at the hemispheric level, which are going to open up opportunities for local firms in the Caribbean to be able to target partners hemispherically, but also specifically in the case of the United States. Finally, and we'd like to also focus on the need for the business organization support regimes in the region to provide assistance to companies. And in addition to Caribbean Export, I think it's fair to say that we now have beginning to get fully grown the new Caribbean Private Sector Organization. For decades, we had the Caribbean Association of Industry and Commerce. I think now the role of CPSO is going to be critical, as we've seen in many of what we call the domestic regional market issues critical to firms of the CSME, but also now to undertake and engage extra-regionally. That corporate focus is critical, and particularly in the case of the policy arena, which we discussed in our initial webinar last December, and the hopefully soon upcoming next meeting of the CARICOM US Trade and Investment Council, which provides the policy framework for trade and the US and the region. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities for regional private sector firms, both individually and also at the business association level, to move forth. So we're very pleased that the SRC and the University of the West Indies took on this task. Great work by Janive and the team in Barbados. We certainly all envious of having to work in a difficult climate like Barbados. But I just leave it to you all now. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of you as participants. And as Janive mentioned, we will be sharing everything on the web links afterwards, and look forward to more engagement with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. Always a reliable partner, and especially helping us in securing many of the speakers that you will hear from now, which brings me into a wonderful segue. Let me introduce our stellar cast of panelists. The panel, let me just say, is not necessarily representative of our regional business community, as we have no ladies on the panel, but our efforts to assure gender representation were not successful this time, although we did reach out. The women that we reached out to are extremely busy as well, and we will remedy the gender representation in our next webinar. To start, let me introduce Dr. Scott Mcdonald, who will be our main presenter. He's a chief economist at Smith's Research and Gradings, and has worked previously in a number of leadership positions as managing director and chief economist in a number of companies. He's a member of the CPC and writes frequently on Caribbean economic and policy issues with the United States. For today, Scott has prepared a briefing paper, which he will present first, and which our other speakers have been asked to sort of speak to, but also expand as necessary. That paper, which is a short 14 to 15-page document, will be made available to participants after the webinar once it has been finalized, following feedback from you as well as the other presenters today. That will be on our SRC website. Let me also welcome Mr. Stephen Whittingham, Chief Operating Officer at GraceKennedy Financial Group, a Jamaican company which specializes in food as well as financial services. Next, we have Mr. Anthony Ali, who is Chief Executive Officer of Goddard Enterprises, a Barbadian company with multifaceted approaches to business spanning the manufacturing, catering, automotive, building supplies, and financial industries on a multinational level. He speaks today both in his capacity as CEO of Goddard, as well as a member of the CPSO, the CARICOM private sector organization, and he is a member of the CPSO. And finally, let me welcome Ms. Dr. Damie Sinanan, Manager of Competitiveness and Export Promotion at the Caribbean Export Development Agency, the Regional Trade and Investment Promotion Agency in the ACP, the only one established in 1996 by an intergovernmental agreement as the trade promotion agency of the 15 members of CARIFORUM, which comprises CARICOM as well as the Dominican Republic. Our lead presenter, Dr. McDonald, will speak for 15 minutes, after which each speaker will speak for no more than 10 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to the audience's participation, both your comments as well as your questions. So if in the duration of the presentations you have a burning question or comment, please utilize the Q&A function, and we will either reflect that or open up the link so that you can orally provide your contribution and allow our presenter and speakers to respond. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. McDonald.
Thank you very much, Dr. Remy. I'd like to start off by saying thank you very much for everyone at SRC and David Lewis at the Caribbean Policy Consortium for helping put this panel together. And it's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. I have to admit that when I agreed to do this paper, I found it a daunting process. After all, I was being asked to write about Caribbean US business relations in the grand sense, investment, trade, where are the opportunities, and put it into 14 to 15 pages. And that covers everything from manufacturing, rum distilling, hot sauces, beer, business process outsourcing or BPO, fintech, and captive insurance. And it also, if you take a spin through US grocery stores, there's the familiar names of Red Stripe, Pick a Pepper Sauce, Mount Gay Rum. It's all there. The Caribbean is connected with the US. But as I got deeper into the topic, I found it a very compelling story, and I found a lot of energy. And in some aspects, it's as though the COVID pandemic and the change of what's going on geopolitically has provided a catalyst for the Caribbean to recreate itself or to refocus in a different direction. And I think there's a big realignment that's occurring not only in the Caribbean, but also globally. I got a sense of this energy, and I'll quote from the GraceKennedy 2021 annual report. Yes, people do read those. And basically what I liked was the energy that came out of this was, although we are small, GK's leaders have big, in capital letters, dreams. And our team has put in the work to deliver taste and other multicultural foods to the world, and leading financial services to our region is firmly on. And it also says a little bit later on, with operations now spanning the Caribbean, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and Europe, GK has become one of the most iconic representatives of brand Jamaica worldwide. Not giving an advertisement here for GraceKennedy, but The point is there's an energy level there that's exciting. And in that context, I have to admit, I am very appreciative to sit with representatives of two of the older and more established companies, GraceKennedy, which was founded in 1922, and Goddard Industries, which was founded in 1921. I got that right, I believe. Between them, they have over 200 years of innovation, adaptability, and success. And there are plenty of other Caribbean companies that fit the bill of being innovative, adaptable, and successful. Another reason I found that this exercise was daunting is all the changes that are going on. To quote Vladimir Lenin, who is not a capitalist or a businessman, but Vladimir Lenin did make the comment, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. This compression of time and events is a big factor. I've got nine things I will briefly go through. Each of them could end up in a book by themselves, but I'm going to go through them very quickly. First, COVID-19 is a Schumpeter-like creative destruction. It has changed the way we live. It has pushed digitalization, use of non-cash currencies, the idea of work for home. And in the United States, it's been reflected by Netflix, Zoom, and Peloton. But it also brought a huge amount of attention to the need to restructure US supply chains globally. In the Caribbean, I think it's led to a very serious reassessment of the central role of tourism and what other things can the Caribbean offer the world. The second point is that globalization has peaked. It's not dead, but it's peaked. Regionalization is replacing it. And by that, I mean, we've gone from global supply chains, the sort of instant consumer gratification, and the world is changing. That's not going to be on the table the same way. Regionalization is replacing it. The third point, which is directly related to that, the globalization has peaked, is that geopolitics have returned. Without going into a long treatise on it, in 2018, the Trump administration started a trade war with China. It was America first. Biden administration is in, and it's Buy America. And if you're not looking, it's very easy to understand that this is a different regime from what we've had to prior administrations before Mr. Trump. Certainly the Russo-Ukrainian war also reflects that geopolitics are back, and what we've seen with that are ripples that have gone through in terms of fuel and food prices. The fourth point, the US political establishment has embraced nearshoring. There is a bill in the US Congress called the Western Hemisphere Nearshoring Act. Very briefly, the sort of synopsis of it is free trade and expanded commercial ties between the United States and the Western Hemisphere partners will foster economic and commercial cooperation, increase investment opportunities, decrease migration and violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, reduce our dependence on the People's Republic of China, and create jobs for American workers. While Democrats and Republicans in the United States don't agree on much, they agree that China is the main rival, and they have also embraced the concept of nearshoring. The fifth point is de-risking in the Caribbean has hurt, but it's forced changes. There's the old saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. In the Caribbean, concerns from advanced economy banks over money laundering and financing of terrorism have led to tougher supervisory and regulatory regimes. It has also pushed, I think, a lot of Caribbean financial sectors to go into different types of businesses, fintech, e-commerce, captive insurance, cryptocurrencies. So I think you have a stronger financial system than you had before, despite the damage done by de-risking. Sixth point, we have a shift going from old fossil fuels to green alternatives. This is a big issue. Guyana and Suriname certainly raise lots of questions, but there is a longer term trend towards green economies and alternative fuels. The seventh is the promotion of the blue economy. I think that it's directly, obviously, tied to greening of the economies, but this is the greater utilization of ocean resources with an eye to conservation, measured usage, and the the preservation of ecosystems. And number 8 is the promotion of the creative and orange economy. One of the things that I quite enjoyed was reading about the Caribbean Export Development Agency's active involvement with the Business in Music program, which was set up in 2016. The creative sector in the Caribbean is dynamic. It has a lot to offer. The ninth and last point is the aging of the US workforce. Deloitte and the US Manufacturing Institute recently came out with a study that said by 2030, as many as 2.1 million manufacturing jobs will be unfilled in the United States, costing the economy as much as $1 trillion. The same concerns are being raised in terms of healthcare, services industries, business solutions, entertainment. The US needs skilled workers, or it needs nearshoring. Now, what do these changes mean in terms of Caribbean business? One, the US is now more interested in the Caribbean. And there was a lapse, I think, of US official interest. Business stayed, but the energy level was not as exciting or as filled as it is now. Caribbean governments in the US are adopting rules and regulations to help facilitate nearshoring. US companies are increasingly implementing nearshoring strategies. That includes Fortune 500 companies, but also smaller companies. Caribbean countries are looking for partners to develop the green sources, cleaner sources of energy. Ag tech is going to be a big growth area for a number of reasons. And the gentleman from the Caribbean Export Association there was nodding, and he should, because they've done a great job working on this area. There are new demands for sustainability and inclusiveness that could make traditional sectors willing to increase local linkages, i.e. tourism, along the lines of the orange economy and blue economies. And the other aspect is, and this is really critical for a lot of Caribbean companies going to the US and Europe and the UK, Caribbean governments and companies are leveraging their respective diasporas in the United States. Diasporas provide remittances, but they are a marketing beachhead for Caribbean products, and there is a market for it. I'm very quickly going to go through 4 sectors. I mean, I could talk for days, and I know the clock is ticking, and I think I'm down to 6 minutes. So I'll march through this relatively quickly. One, the business processing outsourcing, BPO. This is a dynamic growth area. And for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, the Caribbean has the ideal spot. It has cultural ties, political ties, linguistic. It has a relatively good educational base. It fits this, and this is going to be a growth area. I think the CARICOM Caribbean was relatively slower in getting into this line of business than some of the competitors in Latin America, like Costa Rica, or further afield in the Philippines. But the Caribbean has got an edge here, which I think you're beginning to see the potential being reached. What was quite exciting was to see that the Site Selection Group magazine, which rates countries in terms of their BPO facilities, it put the Caribbean into the hyper growth region. That's a real plus. Jamaica has done a very good job with this. There's about 44,000 employees in that sector as of June 2021. The numbers that I was able to dig up was in 2012, the sector generated around 230 million in revenues. In 2021, that was up to 780 million. Growth area. Jamaican government worked hard with the IDB. They created the Global Services Sector Project, This has helped sponsor it, but the private sector has been actively engaged in this, including startups like ITEL, which recently opened up 750 jobs in St. Lucia under this type of program. So I think this is a growth area, both to ITEL actually has a US operation for Caribbean countries expanding out of the region, but also for US companies coming down and they have business needs. The second area, very briefly, is agribusiness. This, obviously, the Caribbean has food security issues. I want to say 80% of the food needs are met from the outside. That may be an inflated number, but I've seen all sorts of different numbers. The second point with this is that COVID changed eating habits in the United States. It brought people home, and when you go home, a lot of people work where? They work in the kitchen. And when you're in the kitchen, what do? You snack. And this has brought a huge boom in a number of different foods and a willingness more to experiment. The other point with the agri industry is diaspora communities have helped expand this market, but you're beginning to see millennials seek out more interesting and quote unquote exotic products. Just remember, US fruit and vegetable market is valued at about 62.5 billion, and it's expected to grow by about 5% from 2022 to 2030. The Caribbean should get a bigger slice of this market. I could talk about sauces, but suffice to say, Jamaica is number 10 in the US sauce and seasoning market. I guess it's behind the Philippines. It has 1.4% of the US market. I expect that to grow. So there's a lot of other things on that menu, but time's marching on here. Energy. There is going to be a lot of money going into energy. Some of it's going to go into fossil fuels. It certainly is in Guyana and Suriname. I believe that most countries in the Caribbean are going to be out looking for oil if they're not already doing so. And the question is, the temporary nature of this. Fuel prices have been up because of the Russia-Ukrainian war, but that's a big issue which the Caribbean is I'd say is in the middle of a big debate. How much do you rely on it? How do you make the transition to green? Certainly it's a big issue in Guyana and Suriname. So I'll leave that where that is because we could talk about it much more. I do want to say that there's been a lot of discussion about central banks playing a more important role in greening, and the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank did make the change to photovoltaic panels, and that was done with the US company, Azimuth Energy. They worked with a British Virgin Island company called ATEC, and they put their money where their mouth is in terms of making these changes. The last sector is the orange economy. It's a very broad concept. Very simply stated, it's taking all the creative dimensions of the Caribbean, arts, culture, heritage, media. It's a mix of science, technology, innovation, and the idea is to improve the quality of life. The idea is also to hub, to create a creative center, and this requires education. As I mentioned earlier, there have been programs put into place to do this, but you've watched big companies in the United States like Zoom, Disney, IBM, Apple, Amazon. They're all into the orange economy. And it is an economy which I think is going to grow. It's been successful in Colombia, where it initially got off the ground. I think the Caribbean has a lot of room for growth with that as well. Very briefly, since I think I'm running out of time here, I've got a few recommendations that I think are worthwhile. I think the Caribbean needs to do more to distinguish itself from Central America. US policy tendency is the blob. It's to put it all, Central America and the Caribbean are the same. It's one big thing. It's not the case. I think the recent meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris and members of CARICOM heads, I think that was a very important step in doing this. But it's important in terms of the ability of CARICOM countries to articulate their needs and get attention in Washington. The second one is Caribbean companies looking at the US market need ongoing intelligence. One of the things about GK, they made an equity purchase, I believe, in Blue Dot, and Blue Dot is it's data, and the Lauren Pratt, who's the founder, made the comment is data is driving the future of business, and we are looking forward to growing and expanding Blue Dot into new markets with the latest in data intelligence technologies. I think this is critical going forward, but it also is important in terms of identifying trends. And then the other aspect is there's got to be better intelligence on which parts of the US government do you deal with. That's another issue altogether. I would also strongly encourage further efforts by the Caribbean Export Development Agency along the lines of, I loved the annual results report. That's top notch. It makes it granulizes the data that's there, but it also presents that Caribbean companies can be successful. And it's flag waving, it's the cheerleading, but whatever it is put together, it's a positive message. I like the Ag Tech conference. I think that is going to be, like I said, a real growth area. And I also like the partnership with Republic Bank and the workshop for small businesses. Partnerships, innovation, looking for the cutting edge. This is the type of energy that the Caribbean has, and I think it's beginning to be channeled through that. I'd like to see more of that. Two quick real points in the end here. One, I think when Caribbean companies look at the United States, they need to look beyond Washington, D.C. And I believe the gentlemen that are represented here have done that, but a lot of the state governments, they have their own promotion programs. They are looking for investment. The last point I would say, well, 2 points, the Caribbean Central American Action, or the CCAA, was an organization in Washington which represented Caribbean and Central American interest. They had an annual Miami conference. It was a sort of focal point in Washington. It was able to articulate a lot of things that people in the Caribbean wanted in the US. And it was a good meeting. It was a forum. It ended up, I don't want to say going out of business because it was a nonprofit, but the organization ended. But I think the Caribbean needs to think about something like that in Washington. The last point I'll make here is I think this is an exciting time. Like I said, there's a realignment. And the US is approaching trade and investment with the Caribbean now with more interest, and time is a factor. I'll leave you with a quote from Benjamin Franklin, who is one of the founding fathers here in the United States. Lost time is never found again. And I'm done. And I apologize. I think I went 20 minutes, but I apologize.
Listen to me, Scott. I usually am the most fastidious one with the acts for time, but I could not ask you. It was such a wonderful exposition of the issues, done succinctly, but not glossing over any of the finer points that we needed to hear. I think what's most refreshing is that, one, you're looking at opportunities. And I think in this time, there's so much to be depressed about, but I think there's this undercurrent of a thriving private sector. And I'm so pleased that we have 2 of the companies that can speak to their opportunities. And I'm sure they'll also highlight challenges of entering the US market. But I think you've laid the foundation really, really well for the following speakers, and also for Damie to come in and tell us about the wonderful work Caribbean Export is doing. So very well done. I'm sure the audience will come back with some questions or comments. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for that. Let me just go quickly now to Stephen from GraceKennedy. We heard a lot about your innovation from Scott. So you take it away and tell us what GraceKennedy is doing with the US market and opportunity there.
Thank you, Dr. Remy, and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And Dr. McDonald, thanks for your presentation. I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. So the topic that we're talking about today is exploring business opportunities for and with the private sector. And I'm happy to share from GK's perspective, GK having been such a material contributor to the private sector commercial activity between the US and the Caribbean for such a long period of time, especially as we celebrate 100 years. It's thank you for acknowledging that, Dr. McDonald. I really appreciate it. It's a big thing for us here at GraceKennedy and in Jamaica. And congrats, Tony, you're a year ahead of us. But if you told someone that GraceKennedy was talking about this topic about business opportunities for the private sector, especially as it relates to the US and CARICOM trade, the topics that would come up would be, GK, the food trade, agribusiness. That would be first to mind. All of the fantastic products that GraceKennedy sells, our sauces, our seasonings, our spices, our beverages that you see in the shelves in the US in Walmart, in Target, in Publix, in Stop and Shop. It's a great source of pride for us at GraceKennedy, and it's a great source of pride for us in Jamaica. You'd also probably expect us to tell a story about how our business grew initially through US-based distributors, but eventually how we acquired our own distribution business in the mid-2010s, replicating the effective distribution chains that already existed in Canada and the UK, where we already owned our own distribution. And that made GK one of the largest ethnic product suppliers in those markets. You may have also expected us to talk about our export business to the US, which is our critical national importance to Jamaica, which is growing. And our group CEO, Don Webby, he is very public about his mandate of ensuring that at least 50% of the output from our manufacturing facilities, of which we have 6 in Jamaica, are exported by 2025, which I think is a fantastic goal, especially for a small market like Jamaica and for the Caribbean. Or since I have oversight of the insurance division, Scott talked about captive insurance in the region in Bermuda and Cayman and Barbados. But actually today, I really just want to talk about the concept of labor, right? Which is a critical, if not the most important factor in the business of sort of exploring the opportunities between the private sector and the US markets. Talk about labor from the perspective of the employee, our Caribbean nationals, from the perspective of the impact that these labor movements have on our economies, and also talk about from the perspective of the employer, the private sector. Because Scott talked about it, but the hot topic, certainly in the labor market in Jamaica, is about nearshoring or business process outsourcing. And the rationale for the focus on nearshoring is clear. Talked about globalization peaking and what that means, but really enterprise risk management has come to the forefront now. When you're seeing situations with these global supply chain challenges that have made it clear to businesses that they may need to rethink the way in which they approach their enterprises, plus rising labor costs due to inflation, and of course they rise in some markets more than others. And then you combine that with really what we have as a talented, accessible, and culturally homogenous pool of talent in the Caribbean, that really makes nearshoring or business process outsourcing to the Caribbean a really attractive option, right? But the need for and the supply of services from and by the Caribbean is not new to the world. It's not a new concept. Nearshoring may be growing now, but migration has been a critical part of our history as a region for such a long time, going back to the Panama Canal, to post-World War movements. It really has been a huge part of who we are as a people. And while GraceKennedy is a formidable entity with large operations in Jamaica and the region, in some ways a large part of our business, and certainly probably one of our greatest distinguishing factors, is the role that we have played in the history and currently play with the diaspora that resides all over, but particularly in the US as it relates to food. You've moved abroad, left your family, and when you go home in the evenings, your kitchen, it turns into your home because you're able to eat the food products that GraceKennedy sells that reminds you of your home. And also the remittances which these people moved abroad to earn a living to send back to their country, of which is a huge part of GraceKennedy's business through our partnership with Western Union, where we represent them in most of the English-speaking Caribbean. Remittances are a big part of our economies. In Jamaica, as a percentage of GDP in 2020, according to the World Bank, it represented 21.4% of our GDP. That's a huge number. And it's similar in other markets in the Caribbean, right? Now, remittances, they're derived from the migration of the workers that go to fill employment voids in the US. Historically, it's been for roles such as nurses or farm workers, but CARICOM nationals have played roles all up and down the value chain. I personally worked in the US at BlackRock in the institutional asset management world, right? So the concept of nearshoring is fantastic. More jobs for the local economies, great. And why is that great? US GDP per capita is 64,000. In Trinidad and Barbados, it's 15,000. In Jamaica, it's less than 5,000. So what that simply means is that there is a phenomenal economic arbitrage opportunity for employees and for our country, right? BPO has been successful in Jamaica, yes, because there was a need, and yes, because of all the things we talked about, but there was also a concerted national public and private sector effort that went into making it a viable and attractive ecosystem to produce services for the international economy. JAMPRO, our marketing agency, really created a vision. HEART, our national training agency, developed customized training programs for workers so that we could they would be employable. The Development Bank of Jamaica put together financing packages. Our regulatory bodies changed the regulations for pension funds so that and insurance companies so that they could invest in capital infrastructure for the sector. And the private sector, look, they invested, right? And I can tell you, GraceKennedy is one of them. We built a call center, retrofitted what was the central sorting office for our postal service and turned it into a call center for one of the leading BPO businesses in the world. And that has worked out to be a great investment for us, but a great opportunity for our partners and a fantastic opportunity for Jamaica. And it really shows what happens when the public and private sector are aligned. So guys, together as a country, Jamaica built almost what's $1 billion business with 50,000 jobs in Jamaica alone. If you were looking at that from the outside and you said you were an international VC, you would say, we've built a unicorn. And that's something really special and something that we should take as a big part of how we move forward, that excitement about how we think about our markets. Now, that's important really because from GraceKennedy's perspective, we've really focused on all of the businesses that have grown over time, and we have been a part of them trying to support them. And the concept of nearshoring is going to continue to be a big part of how we operate. Aging populations, as Scott said, changing dynamics in the job market. There's an insatiable need, for example, for workers in the logistics sector. If you take, for example, the US trucking industry, which in the long term, we may understand they move to autonomous vehicles, but today there's estimated to be an 80,000 person shortage in truckers. Walmart pays a starting salary for a trucker, $110,000 US. That's an attractive compensation package for our market. And that job can't be done remotely from a call center, at least not yet. So the Caribbean labor in the form of nearshoring or migration will continue, in my opinion, to be the key driver of commercial activity between the US and the Caribbean. So if we acknowledge this, I think there are three things we must do, and I'll just leave you with these three things. We must invest in training, whether not just educational training, but also vocational training. And I'm not talking about the public sector only. I'm talking about the private sector. Industry must do it. If we are afraid to train our people for fear of losing them, that's a bad situation, and we're only hurting our companies and hurting our countries. We must be proactive as a group and not reactive about the industries we designate for mass training. In Dr. McDonald's great piece that I read, he refers to it as what is hot and what is not. For example, if we as a region and with the companies had invested in technology 10 years ago, if we had invested in training people for coding, for app development, for other technical skills, the writing was clearly on the wall. our region would be exponentially more wealthy today than we are now. And this could have been achieved in a relatively short span of time with relatively little investment, especially relatively to the context of the upside that has clearly manifested itself globally. GraceKennedy, for example, has recently, we built out our digital factory. We have 40 professionals that are focused on simply building technology for us to deploy through our businesses. We're a food company, a food and a consumer goods and a financial company. And we have a dedicated team of people that are building solutions for us. Imagine what would have happened if as a region, we were 10 years ahead of where we are today. What that would have meant for us, especially as the shortages of labor in the US have become so apparent. And lastly, we have to ensure the free movement of legal funds across borders, okay? Dr. McDonald mentioned this, but we really as a region are challenged by the concept of de-risking and the compliance requirements associated with global anti-money laundering rules. Now, I run a financial institution, so I'm not gonna at risk of getting myself in trouble, but I will say this. Being responsible as an international community should not mean that our people, our Caribbean people, have a hard time moving their hard-earned money back home from the countries in which they work to support their families in the region. And we at GraceKennedy, through our partnership with Western Union, we try to do our best to make that process as seamless as possible for our customers. But I think as a grouping, we need to try and make it much clearer that there's a big opportunity for us to improve in that area. I'll stop here. I look forward to hearing the remarks from the other panelists and taking any questions at the end. Thank you.
Wow, another stellar presentation. Again, everybody is kind of, budging against the time limit, but I'm so engrossed, and I'm sure the audience is that I'm not putting the gavel down on the time. But Stephen, that was wonderful, especially looking at, looking at all of these topics and exploring it, including the business interests through the prism of labor. Because what you managed to do is tell a story about the business model of GraceKennedy, really, which is looking at, the demand of the consumer from Jamaica in the US also, but looking at remittances, eventually you got to hear about opportunities, not just in nearshoring, so investment into Jamaica, but also in the trucking industry, and thinking about the things that have to accompany that movement of persons, but also of capital between the US and Jamaica, but more broadly the Caribbean. So I think really great remarks, a great way of telling the story, and I'm hoping that the audience is gonna ask a couple of questions to you as well. So thank you for that. Really well done. Over to you, Tony. We want to hear about Goddard's story as well, and any perspective you have to share.
Great, thank you. Well, again, thank you all for inviting me to participate. Dr. McDonald, really enjoyed your paper. It's interesting, the paper parallels a lot of the things that we are trying to focus on at the CPSO level. So I'm gonna try and make my comments relative to both Goddard Enterprises and at the same time focus on the agenda and the comments that came in from the CPSO. So I think the paper is a useful contribution to the discussion taking place across CARICOM and among other developing countries on the urgently engaging market opportunities to emerge from COVID with more resilience and growth and future development. Obviously, there's no denying the fact that trade relationships between CARICOM and the US occupies a very important nexus for us. And the need to develop that trade relationship is going to be critical in how we move forward. In this regard, nearshoring with the United States represents an opportunity for the Caribbean in several important areas, which were covered by Dr. McDonald. But some of these solutions must be set in the broader context of the Caribbean assessing market opportunities, both intra-regionally, hemispherically, and from a global market where the Caribbean products and services hold an advantage. And, again, GraceKennedy has been able to show exactly how that can be done through their success. In this context, nearshoring with the United States holds does not hold a significant place, does hold a significant place, and more attention is definitely needed to build out this relationship. But it must be viewed in one of many trade relationships which will need to be developed by the CARICOM and the private sector group within the region. Developing firms to the level at which they can effectively participate by communicating and connecting with global value chains and value shops, where professional services are geared towards solving consumer needs rather than creating value through output, has been given new impetus in the Caribbean by the private sector, beginning with the period preceding COVID-19, but accelerating remarkably through the pandemic. Supplying global markets, whether through nearshoring with the US or whether elsewhere within the hemisphere, and that could be Canada, South America, Central America, requires more regional firms to develop the capacity to participate, and it requires the enabling environment at the national and regional level, which within the CSME and CARICOM to support the private sector enterprise in these areas. And that's one of the areas that I think we are really missing right now that needs to be developed. The road less traveled by the regional private sector has been collaborating with government at the CSME level to develop the genre of policies that are critical for the liberalization and maturation of the CMSE space that the private sector requires for investment and growth. And again, Stephen kind of touched upon this. It's one of the key pillars of the CARICOM Treaty of Sagaramas, which I'll talk on a little bit further. A focus on the creation of an unencumbered but adequately regulated CSME will significantly add success to the value of CARICOM and the private sector participation in global markets for goods and services. Simply put, the private sector requires solutions to areas such as the plethora of behind the border measures of goods and services that constrain greater capital participation and sustain benefits in several of the growth areas identified in the paper. Urgently developing foundation elements supporting the education system to focus on science, technology, engineering, math, plus arts and digital education, which we characterize as STEMAD, remains a prerequisite for nearshoring. In this regard, Jamaica has held a much more connected and well-informed position than others regarding the requirements for successful participation in global labor markets, which Stephen talked to. This outward orientation, which has been unilaterally held by Jamaica, needs to become a shared action amongst all Caribbean entities and other countries, particularly those lacking the educational infrastructure to support global market participation, including nearshoring with the US. The single CARICOM space for ITC to drive down cost, increase efficiency, and make the region a serious candidate for the race for information and database services, protecting intellectual property rights through a single registry, the legal frameworks that speedily resolve disputes, bankruptcies, mergers and acquisitions, etc., will remain important for the private sector to more effectively participate in cross-border CARICOM-wide endeavors in taking advantage of nearshoring as well as the numerous global market opportunities that exist. For several of the nearshoring sector opportunities identified in the paper, the CMSE would appear to offer tremendous value and a knowledge which has now become well diffused in areas such as renewable energy, which offers potential opportunities in the CARICOM market as perhaps the most lucrative for the private sector. Underperforming capital assets exist in virtually every CARICOM country. The technical expertise now exists generously, and the region has less than 10% of its energy needs supplied by renewables. In this sense, the regional private sector has been and must continue to position itself as open global participants, including countries such as China, Australia, Canada, and Europe. Caribbean partnerships are already beginning to mushroom with private sector firms in all of these areas and with many of these countries. Here again, the Caribbean must open itself up to relationship with global players wherever they exist, including the US. CARICOM imports about $4 billion in agri-food products. Roughly half of these are from the US. And So the first task, which falls to the region, given the wide diffusion and declining cost of technology and the excess labor capital and land within the region which we possess, is to reduce the level of these imports. The CPSO, at the invitation of the heads of government, has undertaken a study approached at and aimed at the assessing of business cases which can be supported by regional private sector, unifying the segments markets of the CARICOM, divided by national standards and non-tariff barriers, constitutes the most urgent task to be undertaken to extract significant market value and opportunities in agri-food markets. There is no doubt that some of the exports to the US would add value, as is demonstrated by the examples of exports of condiments and sauces from Jamaica, like GraceKennedy has done. But significant opportunity for CARICOM lies in the intra-regional market and supplying the markets on neighboring countries. The figures themselves speak loudly of what the opportunities are. The paper makes the point that the Caribbean private sector organization needs to play a more aggressive role in selling the Caribbean private sector to its counterparts in North America. Unfortunately, that is not one of the main goals of the private sector organization. Not that it shouldn't be, and not that it's not important. The CPSO was really established to provide a driving force to the CARICOM heads of government to fulfill the implementation of CMSC within 5 years. And that, to me, is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have. While the CPSO will no doubt address some of the issues in the paper, in our first year of operation, and we've only been in existence for 5 months with a functioning secretariat, the US-CARICOM trade and investment relationships is not yet on our work program. So the CPSO is involved in many issues closer to ensuring the 4 freedoms. And, Stephen talked a little bit about this. Our goal has to be the free movement of goods, labor, capital, and services. With that done at a regional level, we can then definitely exploit the opportunity for nearshoring. But if we attempt to address this at the individual state level, at the individual country level, I'm not sure we're going to be as successful as we can be. And I guess that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, is that, as a private sector organization, we are definitely prepared to engage in the matter of US CARICOM trade and relationships. But in order to get this first, our priorities has to be collaborating with our governments and making sure that we as a region can actually capitalize on the issues. And so, there are a number of barriers that exist today that prevent us from really capitalizing on nearshoring. One of the ones, Stephen spoke to a couple, he spoke to definitely the labor and the opportunity that is there. I'll speak to one of the barriers, which is logistics within the region itself. Even though we import 40, 50% of our goods from the United States into the region, intra-regionally, it is almost impossible to move freight effectively for a whole bunch of reasons. And that's one of the challenges that I think we have to really focus on. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my brief comments, other than to say that, the paper itself identifies a number of areas that are critical to the CARICOM. And a number of businesses, the private sector, and a number of the countries have positioned themselves to try to capitalize on that. I think Barbados has done an amazing job with respect to energy. And the fact that the government and the Mia Motley government has stated that we want to be 100% off fossil fuels by 2030 is an ambitious goal, but one that I think the entire country has rallied around. And you have, the light and power systems, you have the regulatory environment systems, you have the government itself in terms of policies and procedures being implemented from tax and duties that are helping to drive that forward. Those are the kinds of initiatives that we need to really set ourselves as goals for the region, and then figure out how do we remove the barriers that complicate the issues and will allow us to then capitalize on nearshoring. So Jean and Dr. McDonald, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to any potential questions.
Another good, great innings here. Thank you so much, Tony, for these remarks, especially, wearing, I know it's a difficult hat to wear, both CPSO and CEO of Goddard, but it seems as if what your positions were, or your perspectives were perhaps reflect both, that for Goddard, it makes more sense to focus on the intra-regional market and be restricting trade there, even though I know that Goddard has worked very hard in ensuring that its footprint lies not just in the region, but also beyond. But in terms of the priority of the sequences of events, I think the focus on the intra-regional market is interesting. And I think it exposes sort of I wouldn't say it's a crisis of strategy, but certainly a difference of strategy of some countries. Some countries in CARICOM going ahead with bilateral relations with the US, perhaps some would say at the expense of focusing more regionally. And I hope that comes up in the questioning, because I think the two presentations, yours as well as Stephen's, kind of highlights, not that it's not important to do both, but what is the right sequence? It's a little bit of walking and chewing gum. Should we be doing both external focus and use that also as an impetus for the intra-regional agenda, or should the focus be on the intra-regional agenda as to make it a more attractive market even for investors into the region, and for streamlining production structures so we are more able to compete outside of the region? So really great that you teased out a little bit that synergy and that potential conflict. So we're gonna now turn to Damie Sinanan, who will speak about what Caribbean Export is doing and give us his insights about the prospects for regional participation in the US market and the US participation in the regional market. Over to you, Damie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Remy. Thank you very much, colleagues, particularly Dr. McDonald for the paper. I too had a very good time. It was paper, 14 pages is just right up my alley. So it was very good, very condensed. I took a lot of information from it, but also I agree with much with what, based on our practical experience that Caribbean Export is seeing on the ground, I agreed with a lot of the conclusions that you drew in the paper. So in terms of my contribution to this distinguished panel, I have a few notes over here, but I just really wanted to speak about particular sectors and how me as Caribbean Export, we really see how can we expand trade, investment and cooperation with the United States using the CBI as a vehicle, and also attracting that foreign direct investment from the US technology transfers as well. Just a quick briefly about Caribbean Export Development Agency. As Dr. Remy noted, we are the official trade and investment promotion agency for the CARIFORUM region. It is really our mandate to build competitive private sector firms, as well as attract foreign direct investment into the region. We've been doing this for a long time, and we hope to continue to do it into the future. We just recently completed our strategic plan for the period 2021-2024, and we're really focused on 3 pillars. The first pillar is export development and promotion. So how do we build competitive businesses in the region that have the export capacity? And once we have those companies, how do we take them out and promote in an international market? The second pillar is investment promotion. How do we attract foreign direct investment into the Caribbean regions into targeted sectors? And we do that by working with our investment promotion agencies in the Caribbean region. And the third sector is services. We look and see services as the next frontier for Caribbean development. The Caribbean region has a number of services outside of tourism that we really focus on: the creative industries, music and entertainment, animation, management consultancies, and so on. And I don't know if I'll preempt Dr. Lewis's presentation, but he did a very good paper for us in terms of services, and I'm sure he'll want to speak about it. So I'll try not to dive too much into his work, because I'm sure he's going to speak about it when his turn comes up. So in analyzing what Dr. McDonald presented, I mean, the first thing that really caught my mind was when he said, the Caribbean is known for tourism. That's our perception, especially in countries such as the United States. Sun, sea, and sand, that's what the Caribbean has to offer. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that, unfortunately, while tourism will continue to be our bread and butter for the foreseeable future, it cannot be our sole source of revenue and of economic development, especially in the small islands. I'm Trinidadian, and we know and we understand that we perhaps depended too much on the energy sector, and when economic crises and the energy prices of energy plummet, it really has an adverse impact on economic development. So we need to focus on diversifying our economies in the Caribbean region. And I'm heartened to know, and I'm heartened to say today, that the Caribbean has a lot more to offer than sun, sea, and sand. We have very sophisticated businesses, very sophisticated sectors, and some of them, I think Dr. McDonald's paper covered quite nicely. So I'll just touch on the various sectors and give sort of my input and my thoughts on the various sectors. The first one is business process outsourcing. And I agree 100% with Dr. McDonald. It's a huge source of growth for the Caribbean region and requires the investment and the policies and procedures that can continue to make this sector grow. We've seen that the sector can be a source of great employment, because really business process outsourcing is about the people. It's about putting persons in seats and giving them jobs. And I saw the example of ITEL BPO, Yoni Epstein. I'm happy to report that, and this is a bit of plugging for Caribbean Export, we hosted our Outsource to the Caribbean conference in Curacao a few years ago before the pandemic. I believe it was in 2019. And Mr. Epstein attended that conference. And as a result of attending that conference and the work that was done, he was able to sign an agreement with the St. Lucian government to open an ITEL BPO branch in St. Lucia, which resulted in about 4,000 jobs. And I mean, that's essentially in a small island economy like St. Lucia, that makes a huge impact. So this is an example of the type of impact that the business process outsourcing sector can have on the Caribbean region. And given what's happening in the United States right now, we offer a lot of competitive advantages to take advantage of the business process outsourcing sector for the Caribbean region. One, we are very educated and skilled workforce. I mean, the level of education in the Caribbean region is very high. Two, we are English speakers, and three, we are in the same time zone, basically, for the Eastern Caribbean. And that's a very big advantage, because when you look at outsourcing, when you talk about different time zones, that we have the competitive advantages that can really benefit the United States in the business process outsourcing sector. So Caribbean Export is committed to doing all we can to really continue to promote the BPO sector to the United States as a viable alternative. With products such as the Outsource to the Caribbean conference, but also seeking that foreign direct investment in the business process outsourcing sector. The second area I want to speak about is the creative industry. I mean, I was happy to hear that our Business of Music program got mentioned, because really we have to build business persons in the Caribbean region. We have a lot of creative persons. Our musicians, for example, are very talented, but it's a seasonal business for the most part in the Caribbean region. So for example, our soca artists, I'll draw from my Trinidad background again. They perform Carnival, they'll perform in Junkanoo, they'll perform in Crop Over, Mash in Guyana. But other than that, it's largely a seasonal business. Many of them have to have full-time jobs for the rest of the year. We have to focus on making this a full-time viable business going forward. And the COVID-19 pandemic impacted live touring and so on. But in the United States, it's largely back to normal. I mean, in the Caribbean region, carnivals are being postponed. We're having Crop Over this year in Barbados, but it's going to be a scaled down version, and this has impacted the livelihoods of many of our creative industries. But look at the United States, touring has resumed full time. How can we ensure that our creative persons can take advantage of the opportunities that are available in the US and beyond? We also have to look at digitalization of business. The way we do business now has changed. No longer can you depend on, one source of revenue, which is touring and selling CDs. You have to look at putting your music up on Spotify and these types of international platforms so you can earn that revenue. And the United States, again, presents an extremely good opportunity to get that done. And I know there's a number of areas that we have to go through. We have to make sure that services are integrated properly into the CBI agreement. But I'll leave that for maybe Dr. Lewis to probably speak about when he has his presentation. I also want to talk about renewable energy, which was mentioned in Dr. McDonald's paper. I mean, renewable energy is a major area for the Caribbean region. We are some of the most we are one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the entire world. We can't look at fossil fuels as our future, because not only is it not competitive from a business point of view, it also presents an issue in terms of the environmental impact. So we have to look at transitioning into a green or greener economy. And I want to bring up a statistic that I saw recently. I just want to make sure I get it correct. So just bear with me 1 second. Let me just make sure. This was in a report published by the International Labour Organization and the Inter-American Development Bank. And it was estimated that decarbonization and a switch to a greener economy will lead to a net increase of jobs in the Caribbean by 3.1%. That is the creation of approximately 400,000 jobs. And in addition, the International Renewable Energy Agency estimates that for every US dollar invested in energy transition, an additional 93 cents of GDP growth will occur. So, I mean, the numbers are there. Not only will it have a vast economic benefit, it will also have a vast environmental benefit in a region that we're already seeing the climate vulnerabilities to take hold. So we have to look at attracting that foreign direct investment and that green energy technology that is available from countries such as the United States of America. And I'll just want to talk very briefly about Agri Technology as well, because, you know, Caribbean Export has been heavily focused on promoting investments in Agri Technology. The Caribbean region, as noted by I think it was Mr. Ali, our import bill is extremely high. We are amongst, again, one of the most food insecure regions in the entire world. We have to look at building our food security, especially given the face of what we just encountered with the COVID-19 pandemic. We have to look at investing in Agri Technology in order to build our food security and to cut our food import bill. And again, investments from countries such as the United States and the European Union can pave the way to getting this done. How do we have that technology transfer and that exchange and that investment that can come in these areas? We see Guyana and we see Suriname. They have these large land masses that we can invest in to ensure that we can produce the food that we need going forward. And the last area I want to speak about very quickly is about partnerships. We have to form the necessary partnerships to get this done. We cannot do it alone going forward. We cannot have agencies such as Caribbean Export, CARICOM, private sector organization, working alone. We have to see how can we bring all these agencies together to unify the work that we're doing. Caribbean Export was very fortunate to sign a number of partnerships. We recently signed a partnership with CICRI to look at how we can partner with CICRI. That's the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. How can we work with CICRI to sort of bring this renewable energy ecosystem to the Caribbean region? And we also signed off our MOU with Republic Bank Limited, which is the largest indigenous bank in the Caribbean region. These banks have the funding. You know, anytime you talk to a private sector person, they tell you that they don't have the funding to put these projects in place or to invest in the technologies that they need. These banks and these institutions have the funding. What we need to do is to work with them to build bankable projects and build private sector capacity so they can access this funding. And that is primarily what our partnership with Republic Bank is about. Building the export capacity and building the project capacity of firms so that they can then access the funding from these financial institutions so that they can invest in their technologies, increase their exports, and pull in foreign direct investment from increased exports. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, Dr. Remy, but I think I will stop there. And I look forward to the discussions going forward and any questions that the audience may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Damie. No, you're good for time. I think we have 15 minutes to discuss with the audience and all the panelists. So I'll just ask that all the panelists' faces be shown for the audience. No, these were some great remarks and really good food for thought as well, Damie. I wonder if it would be useful now, just briefly, to get Scott to respond to any of the things, being the lead presenter here. Any of the remarks made by the discussants of your paper. And whilst you do that, let me just reflect on one of the questions that came up in the Q&A from Gavin Bovell, which is the point on the underperforming capital assets that Tony made, located in territories across the region, cannot be denied. as an organization which operates across several Caribbean territories and having firsthand experience of the challenges of the limited regional logistics, the question is, what are the recommendations for improvement in regional logistics? I just want to make sure that we stay also in answering all of these questions on the point of the webinar, which is really to look at these opportunities for partnership and investment opportunities with the US. So is there some thinking that we can advance through this webinar on how to improve that type of investment, logistics to improve transportation and logistics within the region that we can put forward as for some ideas? And then I also wanted to put to all the panelists this question about regulatory compliance. So how do we think about these market opportunities, but also think about how to match our exports into the US market with the various levels of regulatory requirements at the state level, I think was mentioned, equally at the federal level. And you know, for Stephen and as well as for Tony, thinking about how you have managed to enter into these markets. What type of regulatory compliance have you had to kind of overcome to ensure that there's a market that you can actually penetrate with your goods and services? So first of all, to you, Scott, and then the question that I placed from the audience, and then generally for the panelists to think about any of the issues raised by each other, as well as the regulatory compliance issue that I raised. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you. I pretty much agree with most of the comments. I don't want you to feel as though I was picking on the CPSO egregiously, but part of it, when I was writing the paper, I work with, do a little bit of work with the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. And ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, just had a big meeting in Washington. And their business associations were all over the place, very aggressive, private sector. And it was kind of in that framework that I kind of look at how the Caribbean responds to this. There's a lot of good things the CPSO does, obviously. A couple of quick points, though. One, I think one of the big issues in the Caribbean, which kind of came up between the comments between Mr. Ali and Mr. Whittingham, is there's country brand versus regional brand. And that goes back to the regional development of the Caribbean. How close does CARICOM want to get together? But it also unfolds itself into the issue of logistics. I believe everybody on this panel has tried to fly around various points in the Caribbean. And the delays are amazing. So there's hubs. You go to Puerto Rico, or you go to Miami. You don't need to do that all the time, or trying to get from here to Guyana or Suriname. So that's one aspect. And I guess the other point, and this goes to Mr. Ali, is you mentioned trading with other partners around the world. I mean, I think one of the sort of fundamentals in any economic policy is diversification. You don't want to be overly dependent on one country. I think that's a point well taken. However, my paper was more geared to US Caribbean. So obviously, and since I'm here in the United States, I will plug the United States, but it's a very valid point. I mean, certainly Colombia, Brazil, but you've got Vietnam, India just came through the region. So I think all that's quite important. That's pretty much what I have in response to the other panelists. I'll leave the question to Mr. Ali, though, in terms of the underperforming asset, because it was addressed to him.
Go ahead, Tony, if you'd like. And I'd really like to hear from the other panelists as well about any of the things raised. Tony, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I mean, the comment about underperforming assets, we talk about the Caribbean and the fact that, we are challenged from a number of areas, both in terms of the ability to invest in the infrastructure that's required to make us competitive. And the reality sometimes is that's not necessarily true. There is huge capital available within the Caribbean to lift ourselves up and help the Caribbean become much more competitive from a trade perspective. The barrier that prevents that from happening is ourselves, our governments, our regulatory environment. Just look at our banking. You have a region that has approximately 20 million people, if I don't include Hispaniola, and we have 5 central banks. You try to do a transaction and you have multiple regulatory environments that get in there and try to control what the private sector or business does. And so if we could standardize this, or at least form some sort of policy where once a transaction is approved by either Trinidad or Jamaica or Barbados or whichever, that is then accepted by the others, you remove those barriers and those conflicts of ease of doing business and allows us to then capitalize on our productivity, efficiency, and the capital that we have. The other part is that it's not easy, and Steve made this point, to move capital around the region. Again, such a small region with 5 different currencies and no settlement capability within the region. Every single thing has to go through a third-party intermediary. And we have, again, the region being gray-listed, blacklisted, and to some degree controlled by parties outside of our region, mainly the Europeans and the Americans. And I'm not that they're trying to do this, but I understand their need for control and risk mitigation through FACTA and everything else. But the reality is it puts pressure on the Caribbean. And until we step up to the plate and solve those issues, our capital is trapped. And we can't help ourselves grow and develop out of the challenges that we're facing. So that's what I meant by uncapped potential and unleveraged assets within the region. We have the technology, we have the people, we have the intelligence, we have the capability, yet I find that a lot of times our biggest barrier is just ourselves.
Thanks, Tony. I wanted to give Stephen an opportunity to jump in on any comments he had before I go to David.
Sure. I really just want to echo some of the sentiments that Tony has shared. Yesterday there was a transaction, or a couple of days ago, there was a transaction that was delayed. It was being moved. Funds were being moved, and the rationale for the delay we got, Tony, was that increased scrutiny because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And they're like, we're trying to move money from the US to Canada. We're from Jamaica to Canada. We're understanding what's happening there, but it's really a challenge, right? So the concept of underperforming assets, I'll just share a few thoughts. I think we do have some structural impediments. One is the cost of energy. I do believe that, except if you're in Trinidad, the cost of energy is a problem. Jamaica, Barbados, it's relatively high. And that is something that has I think, impacted the productivity of our assets. And then I think scale is another thing, right? When GraceKennedy has this vision of exporting 50% of its product, what it's really trying to do at its core is trying to make its products more competitive, because we're trying to increase our utilization. Because for us to be competitive, we need to be increasing that level of utilization across all our assets. So scale is a challenge, which is compounded by logistics, right? Because if we were able to adequately supply the region, just moving goods between the markets, as Tony said, is a real challenge. But if we were able to do that easily, I think the competitiveness would become less of an issue, because we would be increasing our capacity, our production. So I really think those are some critical things. And then look, I won't even get into the regulatory issue, because we operate in so many markets in the Caribbean, and I have developed so many regulator friends throughout the region. But I do believe there must be a more efficient way for us to operate. I'll leave my comments at that.
I think that comes up so much, so many times that it's almost a laughing matter now that it's such a trenchant, entrenched problems across the region. And whilst I have Tony and Stephen, how best will represent your interest in advocating for the types of ways to overcome challenges with investment in the region, but also in the US? What is the mechanism that you use or you think will be best to use, whether it's through some advocacy group or directly to governments? How are you representing as business persons your interests? And how do you get it done most effectively currently? Because we're trying to get that representation of private sector interests really understood and improved. And I want to hear from you two on how can we do that more effectively before I turn to David and then Damie.
Well, I'll just start really quickly, and I'll allow Tony to give the more articulate response. My position is that the private sector has to find a way to lead, right? So for example, whilst it's not as great an issue, we have multiple stock exchanges throughout the region. Okay, I'm a director of the Jamaica Stock Exchange, and I have always, as an individual, not speaking as I've always, as an individual, felt that there would be much better synergy in commerce if there was greater alignment between the markets in the region. That's one thing, and I think if the private sector moved in that direction, I think it would be a great stepping stone for the regulatory and public bodies to follow. So I'll stop there.
Tony?
So yeah, sure. So I think Stephen's points are dead on. You look at a number of companies within the region, and they've started to do a list on multiple stock exchange, and that suggests to you that there's a need that is not being met. And to go so far and bold as to say we probably don't need the 4 or 5 stock exchanges that we have, you probably just need one, is not a dramatic and bold statement. It probably is reality, given the size of our individual markets. We don't need to have that much, that many stock exchanges, and then that would also simplify the financial framework in which we all operate. So that's one area. But going back to your other point, we do leverage our governments heavily in terms of making connections for investments outside of the region. There are lots of opportunities for trade visits that we get support from governments that establish them. The challenge is that, a lot of the times they're not specific and geared towards what we would want to do, which kind of leads us, as Stephen said, out on our own. The private sector kind of blazes their own trail. We're fortunate enough that we operate in 25 countries within Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean, that we have a lot of connections and we can at least navigate through. But for small emerging businesses trying to grow outside of their respective areas, I could see where there is a huge need for some sort of centralized function to help businesses make that connection outside.
And that's the role of Caribbean Export, right, Damie? I'm going to put the plug for you, right? So I was going to say, I know the panel is quite heavily weighted in favor of the bigger companies within the region. And of course, in the paper, we've encouraged Scott to look also at what are the potential avenues for the smaller MSMEs, in fact, the nano MSMEs that really characterize most of the private sector in the region. So I think, Damie will probably come back to that in your parting words. Let me just turn over to David for some remarks he wanted to give. I think some reference was made to work that he had done on services.
Thank you, Jenny. Excellent, folks. This has been very stimulating, and I'm sure maybe food for thought for another session. I just think three quick things. One is the whole issue of business partnerships and the organizations. There's a need really to focus on both the domestic, what we call the domestic regional markets, and the external ones at the same time. That's a challenge for companies and for the organizations, but as Janive mentioned, we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. I've been in discussions with CPSO over these years. I understand the challenge and the need to make the CSME and the domestic regulatory framework functional. But I also remind people the CSME, like the CBI in the US, started not by government initiatives. It started by private sector initiatives. So there's not only a role, but a responsibility if we expect these mechanisms to work well. If we leave them only to government, then we're going to be in the bind that we are now facing in the situation. So that sequencing is important, but it also means you need to figure out, okay, how do we at least have some institutionality and reflect the need externally? The other point, just from the work with Caribbean Export last year and with the IDB on nearshoring, just for the small markets in CARICOM, including Haiti, we identified over 100+ business opportunity initiatives in these sectors that Scott has mentioned, but also in educational services, logistics, the health and medical sector, which is going to be the #1 business in this market here in the US for the next generation, as well as everything having to do with what has been mentioned on energy, agribusiness, technology, and so on. All these are services. Energy is not a good, it is a service. So we need to figure out a way how we can leverage many of these opportunities for those companies. Over half of those initiatives, Janive, were small and medium enterprises in the region. They weren't all the Graces and the Goddards and the Masseys and so on. So there's opportunity there for all sizes. And I think that's something to build on. Thank you very much, everybody.
David and Damie, I'm going to allow you to close because we're 3 minutes over time. Sorry to squeeze you.
That's okay. That's okay, Dr. Remy. No, I just wanted to touch on two things. One, I agree 100%. The private sector has to play a central role. They have to lead the charge because they are the ones who are doing the business. They are the ones who are doing the trading. They are the ones who are forming these business relationships. And they are the ones who will attract the investment. So it's always been, very incumbent on the private sector to really advocate for what's best for the region and what's best for themselves and seek their own interests. And Caribbean Export has been supporting that over the past 10 years, and we will continue to support that going in the future, giving a platform to advocating on behalf of the private sector. And of course, CPSO, the National Chambers of Commerce, CaribCham, these organizations have a very large role to play in this area as well. And I just wanted to touch briefly, Janice, you had brought up the question about, meeting the regulatory requirements. That's something that if we're going to trade with the United States, that's something we're going to have to focus heavily on. So for example, on agro-processing, how do we employ the food safety requirements that is required by FSME, the Food Safety Management Act, ISO 22000, the environmental certifications? These are things that we have to focus on in the future if we're going to expand our trade with the United States. And I know a lot of national BSOs are giving support. Caribbean Export is giving support through our grant funding. But also from the private sector, you have to know and you have to learn what are the requirements of the markets in terms of packaging and labeling, and seek what food safety requirements, environmental requirements, and seek the support where it's available in your national ecosystems. Thank you all very much. I only took 1 minute.
Yes, you did. And thank you so much for graciously being squeezed like that. Guys, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to bring this session to a close. Let me first of all thank, as I call them, my stellar panel, Stephen Whittingham, Anthony Ali, Damie Sinanan, and of course, our lead presenter, Scott Mcdonald, as well as David Lewis, who also offered not just his introductory, but some substantive comments as well. We look forward, Scott, to the finalization of that paper, which I think is going to have greatly benefited from this discussion. And we will share it with those of you who have signed up. once it's completed, and it will of course be on our SRC website. Let me also thank the team back here at the SRC, Dr. Skeet, Dr. Kian Skeet, Mr. Neil Knight, as well as all of those who've done a wonderful job on putting this on, as well as obviously our IT expert, Sam Eugene, and just everyone for collaborating with us. Of course, the U.S. Embassy that has made this possible through funding that they have provided for this webinar series. We want to advertise that the next webinar on this three-part series and final one is going to look at the TIC, the Trade and Investment Council, that agreement under the TIFA, using that as an avenue for advancing US-CARICOM relations. And overall, we're trying to do at the SRC is begin to bring all of these things together and present some kind of plan or concerted approach to advancing US-CARICOM relations, especially in this very tumultuous period, but hopefully innovative and creative time in our relations with the US. So thank you, the audience, for sticking with us. Most of you have stuck with us until the end of this 6 minute over our scheduled time, and we look forward to seeing you at another one of these SRC, US Embassy, and CPC webinars. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye, everyone.